Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday, March 27th, and this week we're going to be talking about multispectral imaging. This week, Finn's going to lead us through the slides, so I'm going to hand it over, and we've got Jen here as well. Thanks for joining another episode of Coastal Drone Weekly Live.
So on our agenda today is multispectral imaging and the electromagnetic spectrum. We're going to talk about what kind of those are from like a more science or from a background in that. We're going to talk about some of the hardware, how to get started with multispectral imaging, and then we'll open it up to some questions at the end, and there'll also be a case study. Simply put, a multispectral image is just an image that uses different components of the electromagnetic spectrum besides visible light. So the full electromagnetic spectrum includes radio waves, microwaves, infrared, visible light, ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays. That's the whole electromagnetic spectrum. All of the electromagnetic spectrum is just photon particles all moving at the speed of light, but they have different amounts of energy. Particles with different amounts of energy will have a different wavelength. Everything gives off electromagnetic radiation. Different objects give off different wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation. So because different things give off these different types of radiation, we can measure those outputs.
One of the measurements for like spectrum is electron voltage or EV, right? So the higher the EV is, the higher into blue, purple, right? Ultraviolet is going to be.
Yeah, so a platform that can pick and choose, we can pick and choose what wavelengths to measure, and then we can take those and make it either an image or a map, and then that data, and then that's a way that we can present that data to a client. So the electromagnetic spectrum, they're all moving at the speed of light, but if it has higher energy, it has a shorter wavelength, but a higher frequency. So sometimes you can see it measured in hertz, which is cycles per second, or you can see it measured in like length of wavelength. The length of wavelength and the frequency are inverse of each other.
Opposite.
Yeah. So if you have a higher wavelength, you're going to have a lower frequency, higher frequency, lower wavelength.
And this is the same as like we talk about drone radio spectrums and command and control links, C2 links. There's a little bit of relevance, right? Your average drone is either at 2.4 gigahertz or at 5.8 gigahertz, basically same as Wi-Fi. The higher the gigahertz of the radio frequency, the shorter the wavelength is, the less penetrating power that radio frequency has to go through walls and materials. It's going to be kind of the same with the electromagnetic on the light side as well.
And also radios that aircraft use. So in a multispectral image, so this is the camera from the Mavic 3 Multispectral, which we'll discuss in a little bit more detail in a minute, but the payload on the multispectral has a green, a red edge, and a near infrared. So the green and the red, these are normal, like, a normal RGB camera. Those are the R and the G in a normal RGB camera.
But just to make clear, so each one of these has a filter on it, so it only captures light in that spectrum.
Exactly.
Right. So it would only capture plus or minus, like you look at the specs here, it's 560 nanometers wavelength, plus or minus 16. So it's only looking at that one slice that is green. And because it can only see, just like when you put a filter over your eyes of a red filter, a green filter, everything becomes grayscale of that red. So it's now a black and white image in the green spectrum, a black and white image in the red spectrum, the red edge, and then the near infrared.
Yeah, that's correct. And why are these useful? Well, the red and the green is plants. Like that can help with plant health. And then red for soil. You can measure the health of soil using the red band on that. And then in the next slide, we'll talk about the near infrared and the red edge. So these measure sections of the electromagnetic spectrum that the human eye actually cannot perceive. So these are beyond the scope of human vision. Why do we care about this? It's because plants that are in the active process of photosynthesis will emit electromagnetic radiation within these certain bands. They will emit 50% more in this certain band when they are actively undergoing photosynthesis. What does this mean? It means that if you are concerned about your plant health, you can use a multispectral camera. The more the plants are in the process of photosynthesis, they will glow brighter on the photo, and you can determine whether or not the plants are healthy. As I mentioned, so plants undergoing photosynthesis will emit electromagnetic radiation within certain bands. If we can capture images in these certain bands, it will tell us it will give us an indication of plant health. if you're expecting a plant to be undergoing photosynthesis and you fly the drone over and it's just gray, then something's probably wrong. We can take a normal image. So now kind of talking about, this is a subset of GIS, Geographic Information Science, called remote sensing. We talked about it a little bit last week. In remote sensing, a image, where just a normal photo, this is called a true color image. And then the other type of image is called a false color image. A false color image is when the photo is not true to real life colors. So this is an image from Landsat 5. Landsat 5 was a geosatellite in, I think, mid-Earth orbit that captured false color images of near infrared. In this particular image, the blue is actually near infrared. Where it is more blue, that is, those fields are producing more infrared radiation. So if you look kind of in the top right, there's a group of fields that looks like a Tetris block that's brighter than all of the fields around it. So those fields, there is more active photosynthesis occurring in those fields than the fields around it. So you have to remember that when you're looking at a false color image, it's very similar to RGB. So there's actually only three bands available. So when they're replacing one of the bands with a near infrared, it means that you're going to lose a lot of traditional photo detail, but you get this information.
There's only red, green, and blue pixel values.
Exactly.
If it's a color image.
So in this one, what it looks like is they left the blue the same, removed the green and replaced it with the near infrared, which they're using cyan for. And then the red is mostly left the same, but the terrain appears a lot more red than it would in real life because that's the only value for that terrain. Specialized software is required, and specialized GIS software, and potentially also at least some level of GIS training would be required to actually manipulate this data. Some of the programs that I've used are ArcGIS and Esri. ArcGIS is better at handling vectors and vector files than it is, because this would be a point cloud or a raster file.
Yeah.
Esri is a better software for handling raster files. So when we say raster, that just means pixels. Esri is actually quite expensive.
Yeah, it's about $1,000 to $1,500 a year.
Mm-hmm. So then the other one that I was introduced to at university is QGIS, which is open source. So it comes with all of the benefits and all of the drawbacks of open source, which is, the benefits are, if it's open source, you can use it for free. But the drawback is if you need a feature, you need to add it yourself. QGIS, though, is an industry standard in Europe. It's actually like one of the most used GIS softwares in Europe. So there's a ton of support.
Exactly, I was going to say.
For QGIS.
And plugins.
And then, of course, DJI Terra is also GIS software. I wouldn't call it like primarily GIS software. It's like GIS and other stuff.
It's more photogrammetry, cloud, drone imagery processing that supports not only RGB and 3D, but also multispectral. And so does Drone Deploy. Pix4D Mapper they have a specific module for agriculture. The mapping software we talked about last week all has some component capability, even at the minimum to do an RGB photo mosaic. These softwares could do it because remember, you're still capturing photos that can be layered back and rebuild a RGB photo mosaic as well as a multispectral. We'll show you an example in a bit. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so right now, DJI's kind of entry-level option for multispectral mapping is the Mavic 3 Enterprise Multispectral Edition. We talked about the Mavic 3 the Mavic 3 Enterprise, the standard Enterprise last week in our mapping as like the good do-all kind of drone. Still, if you were going to go and start a mapping business and focus exclusively on building drone mapping, I would actually recommend this drone even for traditional photogrammetry and 3D mapping because they share the same 20 megapixel 4/3 RGB main camera. So the camera on the bottom of the gimbal there is the same camera on both the multispectral and the Enterprise. It can map at, I think, at or faster than 9 meters per second, which is quite fast for drones, if not more. It's one of the features of the Mavic 3 series over the outgoing Phantom 4 multispectral and the Phantom 4 Pro and RTK was the mapping speed pretty much doubled. That means you can do twice as much acreage in the same amount of battery. And then the batteries also are almost 2/3 larger than the last one. So has RTK. So you get centimeter level precision as long as you're using some sort of augmentation to your GPS signal, or you can do post PPK. And again, it uses common batteries. So if you're a run and gun type drone operation and you want to do cinema, video, and everything, you could have a Mavic 3 Pro for that. And then if you want to do mapping at the high end level and do proper georeferenced images and have high level precision, your second drone should probably be the Mavic 3 Multispectral.
Between the multispectral and the enterprise, basically what you're choosing is either the multispectral camera or the telephoto.
Yes.
And both Ian and I, we've talked about this probably at length with each other, but we've both kind of come to the conclusion that the multispectral camera probably has more use cases than the telephoto.
Yeah, especially if you already own, but the standard original one, Mavic 3 Pro or the Mavic 3 Pro Cine or a Mavic 2 Zoom or even the Air 3 because it's got that 3X lens. The 7X lens has very limited utility. Aside from maybe asset inspection, that's really the only niche. So the Matrice 350, we talked about last week. Again, this is the flying pickup truck of drones. It has so much versatility, so much use. There are other platforms. Now, we're talking about this is a third-party payload. The Altum PT is made by, well, it was originally MicaSense, and now it's a division of Ag Eagle. And as you can see, this is a multi-discrete sensor camera, just like the Mavic 3 Multispectral. They are larger sensors and higher resolution. It has a large RGB thermal RGB camera, and then it has a dedicated red edge, green, blue, and near infrared. And then there is a version that has a proper thermal camera as well. The little lens on the right, that's a full thermal camera. So you could actually potentially use this camera for not only doing multispectral crop health, but also detecting hot spots. So if you were doing wildfire detection or something like that, you could do an orthomosaic and show post-fire crop health, and then also post-fire potential detection over the winter.
The camera on its own, if you don't get the attachment for a Matrice, is $16,000 US. If you get it with the attachment to actually be able to use it with the 350, and then I think it's like the DJI Sky something.
Skyport.
The Skyport. So if you get it with the Skyport, so it's actually like 100% compatible with the Matrice, you're looking at $20,000 Canadian probably. And then we're talking about the 350, that's what, like $15,000, $16,000 aircrafts. So we're talking about probably close to a $40,000 investment.
Well, not correction. It's my point out. In normal mode mapping for the multispectral, it's 15 meters per second, which is crazy fast. Mm-hmm. The mechanical shutter is up to 1/2000th of a second. On the multi, the electronic shutter goes up to 1/12,000th, which is crazy fast shutter, which helps with mapping speed. And the other one is the sensor price. The sensor price on the Altum is actually US $20K. Drone itself is about 20,000 Canadian.
Mm-hmm. So you're looking at maybe a $45,000 Canadian investment, which that is a substantial investment for multispectral. However, not everybody is going to be making that investment. So if you are the person that is able to make that investment, you've probably put yourself head and shoulders above what a lot of people could offer in terms of multispectral imaging.
Max is in the chat here saying the 15 meters per second mapping speed on the Mavic, that is too fast in some ways, right? If you don't have enough light, like if the wind's going to be a problem, your shutter speed is going to be crazy high. In order to compensate for that, it might not be ideal for a high resolution map. Other downsides, it's the same as last time we talked about the Matrice. If you're in a niche area and you're working with multiple growers or doing stuff that is not requiring you to travel a ton, this is going to make a lot of sense. But if you need to travel a lot for what you're doing, the batteries are huge. They don't go on airlines. It's going to be a challenge to move the drone around. This payload, though, you can then put this payload on multiple drones. So Ag Eagle actually it's a fixed wing vertical takeoff, horizontal flying drone. So it takes off and then goes 90 degrees over. So you can do larger areas with less batteries and map them out using that drone. Other drones like the Trinity F90, which is a plane that also takes off vertically, but then the propellers tilt and it flies forward. So you're not stuck on just using it on the Matrice. And I think you can also run this on the Matrice 30 with a special adapter.
Mm-hmm. Also, like we're talking about this as a huge investment, this payload will, if you treat the payload well, this payload will outlive the aircraft.
Oh, for sure.
There are other options that are not as expensive. You just need the specialized gear, probably some sort of mapping and processing. I say that it's not strictly necessary if you're trying to sell your services to the agricultural industry, particularly like selling it to individual like farmers. If you just hand them a USB with a bunch of random data on it, they're not going to really get a lot of value out of that. So being able to then take this data and process it in some sort of post-processing, create a map or an image that can give them some of that information, that will be a huge value add. If you're getting contracted by a company, maybe like a geosurvey company, they would probably be able to do the post-processing in-house. Having at least some familiarity with the software would be a huge value add.
The first step would probably be, before you get the hardware, before you get the customer, is find an expert in your area that you can work with and be that I'm willing to invest in the equipment and the skills to operate the technology, but I need to bring you the data that we can then provide to the end users.
Yeah, because ultimately at the end of the day, we try to make these accessible to the general public, but at the end of the day, GIS techs, most of them have minimum a bachelor's degree, but most of them have master's degrees in GIS technology.
I've talked to some people out east that specialize in like feed control and things like that, and they'll use this data and they use it as a checkpoint, but then now you need to have like, what scope is this data going to be captured? Is it weekly, daily, monthly, quarterly? And then what really is happening and how do you correlate that change to the data that you've got? All right, so we've got some example data. This is just to show you an example of what the raw data coming out of a MicaSense Red Edge MX. This is a winery. This was shot using that Red Edge attached to an Inspire 2. And so each of these images comes out as a single band TIFF, target interchange format. So it's like a high resolution, less compressed image. So they're about 2-3 megapixels each. Those photos are all geo-tagged as well with GPS information. They would then get loaded into, in this case, what we were doing is we were sending them over the cloud to a third-party company in Europe that would then process that data, build a multispectral map, and then host it on their cloud platform. And it was winery specific. And what they were doing was they had their own algorithms that would then tell the vintner what was going on with their winery. And the expectation was that this would then be mapped about 6 to 8 times a year. So they would get an idea and a trend analysis or some sort of either did this work, like whatever they're doing, or change management, any kind of warning or potential idea of what it is. We shot something with another group 2 years ago, and this is using the Matrice 300 at the time with the Altum. This was the Altum PT, so this was the new top-end sensor. And basically, it was a area that was under reclamation. We used PPK to map it, so we set out propeller arrow points at 5 different locations on the area to give us the geolocation. So yeah, we used the propeller arrow points that we talked about last week. So those are a post-processing kinematic solution. So you lay them out on the ground, turn them on, they start getting their own GPS recorded location. They then save it to a file, and then they're captured on the map. They show up visually on the map, and then we drop points on those so that the customer is then able to geographically tie that and georeference it. So this is the image that came out of the Altum. And this is the standard RGB composite image. This would have been very high resolution, but it shows you just a full map. So we were able to capture a map. This mapping took about 45 minutes at most. There's transmission lines in the area, so you can kind of see the poles. I mapped this about 10 meters above the transmission lines, just so we had highest resolution possible. Here is the NDVI indexed image, so it's been processed. That shows the multispectral data, and it shows kind of the respective levels of each of the areas. So that's what an NDVI image would look like from the same data with the algorithm processed. And Max in the comments said, like, NDVI, the basic formula for it is it's near infrared with the red data taken out divided by the near infrared with the red added back in. So it shows the differences between it, the normalized difference. There's a digital surface model that comes from it, so it gives you an estimate of what the terrain. So this was quite sloped. Right? There's a 23-meter difference from the bottom of this was on a hill. So that gives you that data as well. This is all from the exact same set of photos that came out of that sensor. And then also the thermal. Now the thermal, like there's some reflectivity in here going on. This was shot somewhere around 11 o'clock in the morning. So there was sun exposure. And so the thermal values aren't going to be great, but you can see green space here. You're going to see what the thermal reflectivity of the denser green brush is on the map. And you can kind of see where the road is, so that's exposed dirt and any potential thermal interaction there. So they zoomed in on one spot and then they removed the soil from it, and you can kind of see what the plant health of the area in particular, and same thing. So they applied a color scale. This area was going to be reclaimed and then potentially set up to be an urban farm. So they wanted to know the viability of the soil underneath.
The multispectral expands, for folks that don't do geomatics, like GIS at all, multispectral expands well beyond 4-band sensor, right? So it's not just the kind of near infrared. There's, a significant number of bands now that you have access to. In the drone world, obviously you're constrained by weight a lot. MicaSense did have a 10-band sensor on the market for a while. I don't think they're making it anymore, and it obviously is a lot more scientific. Yeah, I mean there's a lot. So if you look at Landsat imagery, which is what was brought up earlier, like in Landsat 8 now, I mean there's quite a few different options in there, even on the RPAS, even in the RPAS world. But everybody seems to be going towards that kind of just 4-band and DVI, because it is the simpler and easier to understand.
The reality of it is this is a limited scope for agriculture, because it's one of the most asked questions, I guess, when it comes to getting into drone agriculture is, well, how do you know if it works or not? And this is one of the tools you can use to identify whether or not potentially what you're doing in your drone spraying efforts, what the results of it is. So when DJI markets their DJI agriculture stuff, they're marketing both the Agris line, which is the spray drones, with the multispectral as a check and balance, because you can use it not only to do multispectral, but also to do your RGB mapping initially to figure out where the location is that you want to spray something at a high level of precision. 3.2 megapixels per multispectral band on the Altum PT. So it's actually rated as lower resolution per band than the DJI, because it's not always megapixels that makes a difference of a good camera. It's going to be whether or not it can detect differences in light, just like thermal cameras. Really expensive thermal camera will probably have the same resolution as a really inexpensive thermal camera, but its ability to detect in degrees Kelvin differences is what's going to make the difference in cost. So the Altum is a 3 and a bit megapixel and a 12 and a bit megapixel, where the DJI is actually quite a bit higher resolution. Yeah, so this is the MX Dual, which is basically two of the same, but now they've shifted the bands, so you get 10 full bands on it. One's in the red range, and then the other blue is going to be in a different band set. Ground sample distance is going to basically, that's the centimeters per pixel, right? So if you have 1 pixel on an image, what does that equate to in centimeters in the real world? And so the RGB camera, and this is also, it's going to be a variable of the type of lens you're using, the size of the sensor you're using, the distance above ground that the drone is flying, and then the resolution of the camera sensor itself. And lower resolution is going to be a higher centimeter per pixel count, or ground sample distance. And we talked Google satellite, for example, is roughly 30 to 40 centimeters, I think, these days per pixel. The average drone map is being sold at about 1.5 to 2 centimeters per pixel ground sample distance, based on capturing at about 80 meters of altitude.
Yeah, and then that Landsat 5 from earlier, we're talking about half a kilometer ground sample distance. You can think about it less technically. It's basically, what's the smallest thing you could pick out?
Make out a car.
Yeah. Could you make on a Landsat? You can't make out a car.
No.
You can make out the boundaries of the field, but if there was a fence on the field, you wouldn't be able to make that out.
Exactly.
Because if you think about it, a pixel is the smallest thing that you could see. You can zoom in on a photo all the way into 1 pixel, and then you're just going to get one color. And then if that pixel represents 40 by 40 meters in real life, that means it's going to take the average of that 40 by 40 meters. So if that 40 by 40 meters is a road with a car on it, it's going to slightly affect the color of the road, but it's mostly just going to be gray. There are some satellites currently in orbit that I can't remember which one it is, but the ground sample distance is 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. So each pixel is 1 kilometer. So when you zoom into it, you get very low detail. But when you zoom out and see the whole photo, it's like a spectacular photo of like a whole city, and it from far away it looks really, really detailed.
Yeah, Max and I are both saying like one of the main with the 10 band is it's got the coastal blue. Like it has the proper blue bands, which DJI doesn't. It's more focused on red and green.
I don't know if there's a drone payload for this, but you can also sample in ultraviolet as well.
All right, so that's been a high-level introduction to multispectral imaging on drones. So thank you guys in the comments, and Max and Maya for contributing as well. Like I said, this is one aspect, like we've talked about today, is the kind of the agriculture application of multispectral imaging using drones. There are way more opportunities out there in a lot of different fields, and it's something that's very cool. Get on the web, get in the discussion in community. We're happy to chat more about it and talk about some other examples. Thanks again for watching. This has been another week of Coastal Drone Weekly Live. And if you want to see these live, join us on the coastal community at community.coastaldrone.co. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. It makes a huge difference for us. And put your comments in the chat below, and we'd love to hear your feedback on this video. Take care, and we'll see you next week.